Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening to all of you. My name is Callie Starn, and on behalf of Feminis Veritas, I would like to thank you for joining us today for a conversation about the anti-government protest movements in Belarus and Russia and the role women played in these movements. So Feminis Veritas is a cultural and arts festival that we threw this weekend in Berlin. And this panel discussion is the last event of the festival. So we're so excited that you could be here with us today for our closing event. A little bit about how the meeting will be structured. We have three great speakers with us here today. And after a short conversation with them, around an hour, we'll proceed to a Q&A where you can use a chat function to pose your questions. And a quick note as well, Sophia is currently in New York, where they're on hurricane warning and there could be potential power outages. So thank you for joining us under those circumstances, and hopefully we don't lose her connection, but if she does, that's why. So, and now I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists and then we'll proceed to the discussion. So we have with us Yulia Mickiewicz, who is a Belarusian activist and journalist who was herself arrested during the protest in 2020. And she is the co-founder of the feminist group within the Coordination Council of the Belarusian Opposition. We also have with us Sophia Kishkovsky, who is a journalist with 30 years of experience reporting on the region, and she writes for the New York Times and the Art newspaper, and she holds a degree from Yale in Russian and Soviet history and literature. And lastly, we have Alevtina, who is a program coordinator at the Fund for Belarus Democracy at the German-Marshall Fund of the United States. And for the last 11 years, she has been actively cooperating with several NGOs supporting projects on Belarusian civil society. So the focus of our discussion today will be on analyzing the two anti-government protests in Belarus and Russia, which took place in 2020 and 2021. However, to understand the role of women in these protests and how in the case of Belarus, the protest marked a high point for gender equality and for the visibility of women's issues, a context and background on the role of women in these societies is helpful. So Yulia, I was hoping that we could start with you and you could give us a bit of background in this regard. And before the protest, how was gender equality perceived and what were gender roles like in Belarus? What were the biggest issues women faced?
Okay, thank you, Colin. First of all, for the invitation, it's a big pleasure to be here. According to the gender equality, I would like to mention two main points. First of all, if we are looking to the rating of European Gender Equality Index, you can see that Belarus has a quite high position there, but it's mostly because our government sent these reports every year, not including very important categories and numbers about gender inequality. First of all, it's about domestic violence that also in Belarus, like in Russia as well, has a quite big problem, and numbers they're really very high. And Belarus is the only country in the whole Eastern European region that never ever had any legislation to prevent domestic violence and any legislation to promote gender equality or equal right or something like that. Once it was in 2018, it was like a draft law that was conducted by some women organizations in support and in cooperation with Minister of Internal Affairs of Belarus. The draft law about how to prevent domestic violence, and it was completely approved by the parliament that many of us, we hoped that it for sure happened. But then our so-called president, Alexander Lukashenko, denied this draft law. He said that it's something that's not for Belarus, that it's like a problem doesn't exist in Belarus, and it's something like Western something from the West that is really not very important, and even for him, he could beat sometimes his children. It's normal or something like that. Yeah, and from that time, the situation, of course, was getting worse and worse, and we had some organization who tried anyway to work out with this topic and to help, for instance, women who are like victims of domestic violence in Belarus. But as you probably know, or completely all the non-governmental, non-commercial organizations were liquidated by the authority in one day in July this year, including all the gender and women organizations. What is mean for us that the situation will be getting worse in this topic and in any other. But according to the gender roles, yes, I would like to say that we are still very patriarchal in many ways in traditional society. But of course, it's very much depends on where you live, in which city, in the capital or in the countryside, what your surroundings and etc. The changing in the understanding of the feminist approach and gender equality issues became bigger last 5 years among young people. First of all, we've got different initiatives and organizations like for gender equality topics and for LGBTQ+ and queer organizations, etc. It's a very positive moment, and also, for instance, I'm a general manager in the organization of non-formal education, and for us, it's also like gender equality is one of values and the topic we work with. But also very important to understand that this appearance of women in front of the protest, it wasn't like a very sudden, like it was written in many international media, because Belarusian women, they had a very active role within the families, on the working places, in the organization where they doing something for many years, and they've been in front of the crisis moment in different times. For instance, during the Second World War and during the 90s, I mean, after the USSR was collapsed. And that's why, for me personally, it wasn't so, surprising that women started to be in front of this protest after these 3 very tough August days last year. But maybe about this I will tell more later.
Thank you for that. I think the context will really help us understand the protests as we talked about. And before we go on to sort of examine the protests and compare the two, I just want to pose the same question to Sophia and ask if you could provide context to what gender equality and gender roles look like in Russia. In which ways are they different, and in what ways are they actually very similar? So.
Julie, of course, mentioned some of the similarities between Russia and Belarus in that respect, and both the Soviet heritage in both countries. And as we discussed, Callie, before the talk, I mean, there's a negative difference. The representation of women in parliament is much lower than in Belarus, and in fact, that goes to deeper issues in society, because polls show that that supposedly women in Russia are in fact satisfied with this and think that there's sufficient representation and they don't need any more. At the same time, I think a very important aspect in Russia is the role of the Russian Orthodox Church and its relationship to the state, the official church. I want to separate here the official church and people in the church, because there are some big differences. But the whole question of traditional family values, which have now been enshrined in Putin's new constitution, the one passed last summer. And so as a result, these traditional family values, which they would say protect women's traditional role, in effect end up being very anti-women, and anything that fits into that no longer fits into the role of a family, which is a man and a woman and children. And they're promoting, it's also related to Russia's demographic problems, because Russia is suffering a huge drop in population. And this is something that is frequently discussed. And one of the ways they were trying to solve this is to promote women having more children. So giving money from the government, promoting this on television, promoting things that were kind of from the Soviet era, like these hero mothers, but now it's connected to also to the Russian Orthodox Church promoting this issue. And the Russian Orthodox Church was also involved in the issue of domestic violence and the campaign to decriminalize domestic violence. So whereas before a man could go, or perpetrator of domestic violence could go to prison for that for a significant amount of time, it resulted in instead there being fines. So the organizations that were active in this have now also faced issues. Some have declared foreign agents. I think an issue that we're going to discuss in some of the further discussion. And on the other hand, I mean, you can see also, as Julia mentioned, in cities in Russia, it does depend on where you live. So in Moscow and Petersburg, anecdotally, just very much the people that I saw surrounding me, I could see the families changing in a positive way, that the younger generation, the more global generation, I could just see in the families the equal gender roles, both spouses working, the family sharing the household duties, sometimes even much more than I would see in the quote unquote West, or in families I know in the United States. I mean, I do see positive things in that respect. So, but I think a lot of this is going to depend on what happens further on with the political situation in Russia. And unfortunately, that is not good, but I think that is in our subsequent questions to discuss.
Thank you for that context. And yeah, I mean, you both mentioned sort of issues of domestic violence and sort of these patriarchal traditional family roles that are sort of grounded in the sort of history of the Soviet Union and all the sort of similarities, and yet we see sort of different trajectories when it comes to the protests and the role women played. And so that's what we're kind of going to get to right now, is the protests. And Yulia, if you could start, I just wanted to mention again that you were arrested following your participation in the protests. You are intimately familiar with these movements, and I was hoping you could give us a basic overview of what sparked these protests, as well as the government's response for those in our audience who might not be familiar with what occurred.
First of all, I'd like to say that I was arrested officially because of my participation in the protest. But when I was interrogated before the trial, and also when I was in prison several times, they told me, these people, like officers from different services, first of all from the secret services, that non-official reason why I was arrested is because of my active position within the feminist group and feminist group of the Coordination Council of Belarusian Opposition, Opposition, and also because I'm, as I mentioned before, a manager of the non-formal education, that it's really, they believe that we are like a threat for them, because we within our organization trying to change mind of people for a more democratic way to think, and it was very important because during all these interrogations I saw how they really in panic and tried to persuade me, for instance, that if they wouldn't be beating us or wouldn't arrested us, it would have a very bad consequences for Belarus as a state. And they mentioned very many times that this is just like an illusion and a fake, that this is a protest over all Belarus. But this is the main issue of all this protest. It was not only the protest most huge ever happened in the modern society, in the modern Belarus, but it was and continue to be, by the way, because I don't believe that this is a protest is over. This is a protest of all the society because it was including different social groups, and we not only we but also all the world could see the people in different cities, even in the small villages, who've been on the protest, people from different social groups, like workers that made their strikes, teachers, medicine employees, students, women, IT sector representatives, and businessmen, and many of them. This is very important to know and understand that it's really about all the Belarus. And the second point is that yes, we can't have right now a protest, I mean, on the street, because of the really huge level of political repressions. People have to move from Belarus to different countries, being like political refugees. Like me, for instance, I had to move from Belarus to Lithuania, where I live right now, forcibly, but nothing changing in the people's understanding and people thinking and people mind what was done during all these days and months. That what is really very important to me, and I could observe this during when I participated in these street actions, on female actions, first of all, of course, where I've been, that how we at the Belarusian people became a nation and became a nation of civil society. What you never could change despite of all these repressions. And for me, it's very important that many people, and most of them who relocated to different countries, continue to work for Belarus and for Belarusian democratic future anyway, as I do, and people who, like from my organization, who also could leave the country, unfortunately, for them. And all of us, we understand that this situation is not forever, for sure. And we know that very soon we could come back and continue to work out with all this, what we really believe, because as I repeat many times, yes, it was a very local protest without any, I don't know, not like for EU standing like it was in Ukraine, for instance, on Maidan or something like that. But it anyway a revolution or evolution, as I describe it, for democratic European values that we believe in and we stand for.
Thank you for that answer and sort of touching upon sort of the hardships that followed the protest after the sort of rigged elections from Lukashenko, who's been in power for a very long time now. And I'm going to pose the same question to Sophia, if you could provide context for Russia and the anti-government protests surrounding Alexei Navalny. There are notable differences regarding the involvement of women, both on the ground as well as the parallel yet sort of different narratives surrounding Yulia Navalny, the wife of Alexei Navalny, and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the leader of the opposition, female, and in Belarus. So if you could speak to that, that would be great, Sophia.
Well, first of all, Yulia Navalny from the outset, she said that she is not going to be a politician, but at the same time, we can see in how she handled her husband's poisoning last summer, the way she stood up to the FSB, to that was controlling the situation on the ground in Siberia, the doctors who were trying to block her from her husband, and the Kremlin. She was arguing with them directly via social media. I mean, it shows that she has great political skill. So, but at the same time, I mean, in looking at Yulia Navalny and Alexei Navalny, probably the main thing to understand in the Russian context is that much more than being politicians, they're corruption fighters. And in the comments that she has made, she has said that is also her main objection to the regime and her main goal in fighting with her husband. I think there are also issues to look at. If I'll just speak a bit more briefly about her from in her image, because it's become an iconic image, and it's interesting in the context of feminism, and once again returning to the traditional gender roles in Russia, because their image of this perfect, beautiful family is in fact a model of a perfect traditional family, and yet it is the other side that says that they represent the traditional values. So with that, we can also see parallels to what happened in the US under Trump, of course. I mean, how can it be that Trump was representing traditional family values? But in terms of the role of women in the protests, well, first, I think it's important to say that many women were driven to participate precisely due to the just corruption that permeates everything, and at the same time also to recognize the role of other women on Navalny's team, such as the lawyer Lyubov Sobol, who's now, as so many people, had to leave Russia. She's been forced to leave the country, but before the protests, she had already on his team made a big name for herself, investigating, for example, the school lunch contracts of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man who is often referred to as Putin's chef, since he got his start catering Putin's meals. But he's also accused of running private armies that support Kremlin causes. And she's faced numerous lawsuits from Prigozhin. And there are also a number of prominent opposition activists, not related to Navalny's team, who are municipal deputies. That was were municipal deputies. That was one of the ways in which opposition activists could gain some kind of public voice in Russia, when they ran for local, hyper-local offices, the district councils in Moscow. But now that has become impossible. So, for example, there's a woman named Yulia Galyamina, who's faced repeated short prison sentences and been blocked from running. She was a popular municipal deputy in her Moscow district, and I recall at a demonstration at the moment. Unfortunately, I could not find those notes. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but a couple of years ago, and it was at that time a demonstration that was allowed. So there are certain streets in Moscow where they used to allow these sanctioned demonstrations, and Navalny would even speak there, and thousands of people would come. And I spoke to a man there, sort of a kind of tough-looking middle-aged guy, a businessman, who said he came precisely because of Yulia Garamina, that she is his municipal deputy, where he, at that time, in the district where he lives, and that she is his, model of a great politician who fights corruption and defends people's rights. Another example was a municipal deputy this summer in a central district of Moscow named Kete Haraidze. So she was known for fighting real estate developers, a big problem, a big corruption issue in Moscow, affecting all kinds of things like architectural heritage, and sort of brings a lot of different people together. People who might have more nationalist inclinations and are fighting to save traditional Russian architecture end up cooperating with liberal activists because they're all fighting to save this together. And so she was accused of corruption and what completely appeared to be trumped up charges, and jailed. And it happened to coincide with her announcing that she planned to run for the State Duma, the lower house of parliament, an election scheduled for September 19th. And so much of what is happening right now in Russia in the past months, probably even going back the past year, has been connected to those elections. That the crackdown is on everything is connected to that. Of course, we'll have to wait and see what will happen after September 19th.
The elections are a good point to bring up because there's also been arrests of Pussy Riot members surrounding the elections and trying to clear the stage and make sure there's no sort of outcry about gender issues. So I'm sure we'll get to that later, but yeah, that contextualizes the Russia protest very well. And I wanted to bring Alevtina in. Just it was mentioned earlier by Yulia, I believe, that sort of a lot of gender issues are seen as sort of from the West, and talk to the international element that's at play here as well. Because in your work at the German Marshall Fund, you work on translating sort of the political events in Belarus for an international audience. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, so what was the international response to the protests, and how did the response influence the narrative of women's involvements, or alternatively, how did women's involvement sort of shape the international response?
Thank you so much. I think this is indeed an interesting question, and I would try to give maybe two different perspectives. First of all, of course, I work deeply on Belarus, and this is my sphere of expertise. And I would say that there are different, again, aspects of the EU, for example, concerning about what is happening in Belarus, caring about Belarusian citizens and the nation information, let's say. And another thing is what is happening to the EU. Depending on the protests in Belarus and how it could affect the neighboring countries. Like, for example, the Ostrovets situation close very to the Lithuanian border, and generally having such an unpredictable neighbor, it's not really a secure situation for the neighboring countries. I would say that generally protests in Belarus are not geopolitical. This is important to explain. I think Yulia mentioned this already, that this is not something against EU, for example, or NATO, or Russia, or deeper, so-called deep integration with Russia. For Belarus, it was for Belarusian independence and for building a democratic society in Belarus. So, and women took a very important role in this process, as we all could observe. And here also, I think it's worth to mention that there are different perceptions maybe of women's role in Belarus and or Russia and US or EU, because I would say that women in Belarus, they weren't primarily going out for fighting for their rights, although they were compared even to the suffragettes movement and even to the recent events in Afghanistan, to the women in burqas fighting for their rights. I would say that the primary motivation, and please correct me, Julia and Sophia, if I'm wrong, was to support their men. Even I would dare to put it this way, because after the first, like the worst days after the elections, women haven't been in the front line, and then they kind of had to be, or they took this role. So I just wanted to emphasize this difference, and also difference in the feminist movement and the perception of this movement, and in Eastern and Western Europe or USA. And not going too far from the topic, compare Russia and Belarus. We know that Belarus has been very dependent for many years from Russia, and this was, I would say, one of the crucial mistakes of Lukashenko, that he has become so dependent of the support, not really differentiating any possible options. And in this sense, from one perspective, it is the sort of source of support for him, and he still remains in power, not exclusively thanks to this support, but it plays a very crucial role, I would say, and this also shapes the response of the EU on this situation, and how the EU, for example, can influence it. First thing comes to my mind are sanctions, of course, and this is also another particular and difficult topic. I wouldn't maybe go too deep into this, but just to mention that there is a big debate in Belarus as well, how far it can go, and what are the consequences, whether it's worth it to take such consequences, and still many responses from within Belarus show that they would rather go for these risks, or they would rather bear this burden a bit longer, but just to get rid of this this crisis, or the situation Belarus is in now. Yeah, and as a slow process, I would say the reaction of the EU was in the end quite sufficient, let's put it this way, starting from being deeply concerned, as we used to say, and then especially after the hijacking of the Ryanair flight with Roman Protasevich, they really took action, because it touched the EU citizens directly, and then we could see like really incredibly simultaneous reaction, and incredibly fast reaction, rolling out this fourth package of sanctions towards Belarus. And I believe that still being very much in a difficult situation, I mean, Belarusians being in Belarus and suffering from this economic consequences, there are still there is a big part of the sanctions involving personal sanctions against not only people who are in power and giving orders, but also people who are basically being in action of this. And we even have an example from 2008, if I'm not mistaken, by American sanctions against Belneftekhim, when political prisoners have been released after the sanctions. So I would say this is a very difficult topic, but still worth to emphasize it. So coming back to the international response, I think it's important to notice also, again, coming back to Yulia's comments about Belarusian NGOs being diminished, basically, and activists who had to leave the country, that it's important that the EU stays active, showing their solidarity and support to these people. And especially we can mention Poland, Lithuania, other Baltic states, Ukraine as well, and recently Georgia. These are countries who welcome Belarusians, especially after this last wave of basically burning out civil society in Belarus. So it's important that neighboring countries and EU in particular stay alarmed and they don't eliminate this basically from the agenda, that Belarus stays in focus, and that there is enough support for people who are in need. And maybe to emphasize once more that this is an internal process still, that Belarus, and I believe it applies for Russia as well, that these are Belarusians and Russians who have to fight for the democracy, and they are doing this. And these are their responsibility and their also their faith, basically, to build up these democratic structures, but it doesn't mean that they should be left alone with this task. Yeah.
Thank you for that response. I think you brought up a lot of great points, and I mean, sanctions and these discussions are obviously topics that should be dealt with at length. I think your comments about sort of the different outlooks between Western Eastern perspective on the protests is important to bring up, and your notes about feminism and what the intentions were of the protest early on is a good segue to my next question, actually, to Yulia, which is that very question. So the Belarus protests have been called the revolution with the female face because of the large involvement of women. However, whether this involvement is considered feminist has been widely discussed due to the way in which women were involved. For example, dressing in white as an allusion to like virginity and purity, and also two versions of feminism were kind of embodied by Kishkovskaya and Olga Sparaga, sort of Kishkovskaya representing sort of, well, she said that she would just lead the opposition so long as her husband was in jail, and when he was freed, she would then step down. Whereas Sparaga has been more outspoken and progressive in her sort of feminist views, and so you're sort of faced with these two versions of feminism, more progressive, maybe Western, sort of loud feminism, and this sort of something that's more traditional. And I wanted to ask you, so what is your view on this debate, and what do you think, what role do you think feminism played in the Belarus protest? Really, if you could answer that, that would be great.
Yeah, it's very good, Kali, that you mentioned Olga Sparaga. She was, by the way, my cell mate when we've been together in prison in one cell. Yeah, and we, by the way, had different discussions and even seminars about feminism and gender equality there with our other women who've been there. And yeah, and she published a very good book in German language, by the way, about revolution with this female face. Yeah, I know that we've been criticized by feminists inside Belarus and outside from German feminists. I know also about that this revolution wasn't any feminist or didn't have any feminist approach. It's, yes, as Alevtina mentioned very correctly, that the women took this very active role after these 3 days in August. And yeah, I remember this because I've been on this first female action, and it was we demanded to stop this state violence and repressions against those who've been arrested and imprisoned at that days. And yes, they were mostly men, and it looked like that it was women who've been there because of these men, their husbands, sons, I don't know, relatives, somehow like that. And in one way it was like that, yes. But during the other actions, we had, for instance, feminist column or as well as queer column, people from different LGBTQ plus organizations who've been there with rainbow flags and with the sport posters, as well as we as a feminist or women with a very pro-feminist approach have been there with our posters. And also our feminist group was established at the days also as the response to this to what happening, and for us from that times until now, it's really very important to say that we have been like a part of this protest because for our rights. We've been there for ourselves. Because, you know, women in Belarus, even if they are not like a feminist, I know this from different interviews, research that we've been made, for instance, within the feminist group, women are really very tired to live in this dictatorship during the last 26 years. And a very important moment that happened before the protest, it was, I don't remember exactly, maybe in June, during election campaign, when Lukashenko on interview somewhere on the state TV mentioned something like, woman never could be elected as a president in Belarus, because if she would elect it, she fell down because of these duties and routines, because she's a woman, she couldn't, you know, like handle with this. And I remember the reaction of women, and not only women and men as well, on Facebook and different social groups. It was, you know, like explosion. It was, oh my God, what he said, that's not for sure true. But it was a big fail and a big mistake from his side, because when Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, I mean, decided to be like a candidate instead of her husband, she wasn't mentioned as the serious candidate, and that's why Lukashenko and his surrounding, they allowed for her to be a candidate, because they never, and first of all, he never could imagine that she like as a simple or ordinary housewife, as he called her, could be elected, could get so many votes. And it was very, you know, like a real big fail for him. And it was because, or also because she is a woman. Yes, I know that she many times repeated that she is not a politician, she is not a feminist, she did all these things only for her husband, but it's changing also, and it was in the beginning, but right now she started to say that she continue to be in politics. Yes, she's not pro-feminist, and she's not for gender sensitive, but it's anyway, we could see this, you know, like a way of changing for her as well as for many other Belarusian women. And this is a process. For me, feminism is a process. For me, feminism is about emancipation that already happened within the Belarusian society. And it's for freedom of choice. Yes, it's not like we couldn't say that female protest in Belarus was a feminist, but it was with feminist approach. And this approach was then transferred to the whole protest, because this feminist language that we use was transferred to the whole protest. All this horizontal communication, all this, as we call it, Belarusian blockchaining, when people, all of us, we've been like leaders. We didn't have like one leader, despite that we have Tikhanovskaya. All people could become leaders for themselves. It's a really very feminist approach when you could see this, and it was what Maria Kolesnikova, one of our female leader, by the way, who named herself as a feminist, she all the time repeated to do this. Yes, that we need to continue and we need to get this responsibility for ourselves, being a leaders for our future democratic future and for new Belarus. I could say, and I know this, that when the situation could be changing in the future, it wouldn't be a very simple process to promote feminist issues and gender equality in Belarus, among Belarusian people, and even among Belarusian opposition leaders. But anyway, I really believe that all this, all what was done by different women during this evolution would be continued. And it's anyway, as I said before, democracy and feminism is about process, and it's about values, and it's really what we believe in.
Thank you. That's a nice sentiment. I believe that feminism and democracy is also a process. I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about art and sort of media representations in the protest. And I'm going to pose the first question to Sophia. So to me, it seems that one of the main differences in the two protests has been how they have been represented in the media, both locally and internationally, and the narrative that was built up around the women's involvement. How do you see women and or women's issues and political engagement being covered in the media in Russia? And did you notice a difference in coverage during the protests?
Well, I'd say in Russia, initially, the protests were completely ignored by state media. And at some point when they could no longer be ignored and they started paying significant attention to them and uttering the name Navalny, which they could not utter before since Putin did not speak that name, they started showing extremely derogatory reports, including extremely derogatory ones about Yulia Navalny, about Lyubov Sovol, about Navalny's press secretary, Kira Yermish, who is now under house arrest. And she had an active social media presence, but since she's under house arrest, she can't. So that was very, very noticeable. And I've also, since when I was in Moscow, I'm not there any longer, we were covering Belarus, often from Moscow because our correspondents were not allowed to enter Belarus. So we were watching Belarusian television and the style was very similar. And I think that's not by chance. I think there was a lot of cooperation. But at the same time in state media, one can also see in Russia that they promote female politicians and officials who are pro-Putin. So you have that counterweight. And returning yet again to the whole traditional family values, one person that's often on state media is a woman named Anna Kuznetsova, who is the children's rights ombudswoman in Russia. And so she fits all of these images of traditional values there because she's the wife of a priest. She has a number of children and she speaks out in favor of traditional family values. Now, in terms of the attacks on opposition activists, they take various forms. One is silencing them. So we had discussed earlier, Callie, with you, a woman named Daria Pahoncic, who was an artist, a political activist artist in Petersburg. She also worked with migrant women, and she held protests in Petersburg to defend a young LGBT artist in Russia's Far East, a woman named Yulia Tsvetkova, who is facing up to 6 years in prison and criminal charges of distributing pornography as the administrator of a social media group called the Vagina Monologues. And so she both of these women have been very negatively portrayed in official media, and also, once again, the difference between Moscow and cities far away. Yulia Tsvetkova is from a city called Komsomolsk-na-Amur. It's a military industrial center, and so she faces even more intense pressure than someone like her would face in Moscow, and it would be bad enough there if you become a target of the authorities. And one aspect I'd also like to bring up is how random it can be. You just never know when you're going to become a target. And then there's the issue that now media outlets are being labeled as foreign agents or undesirable organizations, which results in all kinds of repercussions. And the most recent, just a couple of days ago, was a television channel called Dozhd, which is one of, well, essentially the only free or independent television channel with a significant audience. So they're now labeled a foreign agent, which means that they have to start all of their broadcasts with text saying we are a foreign agent, all of their social media posts. It means posting, reposting can have repercussions, posting what they, the news they report. And this was one of the, one of the few sites where these cases would be reported. In other words, it would be a place where people like Yulia Navalny or Yulia Tsvetkova could have a fair report about them. And just something I saw today on a news site called Meduza, which is also a foreign agent because they are based in Latvia, so that they can, or registered in Latvia, so that they can report freely. They just reported on the story, or the continuation of a story of a woman named Margarita Yudina. She, footage of her during the protests in January in Petersburg went viral. She was apparently just a passerby, and a riot policeman kicked her in the stomach, just because. And this image went viral. It was someone filmed it on a telephone, and then the progression was that she was hospitalized, she was injured, and then she appeared on television saying that she forgives the policeman, she holds no grudge against him. But then it turned out that they had come to the hospital to pressure her to do that. And now the latest, and then she started speaking out much more vocally, saying she was pressured, saying she doesn't agree with the regime. And today she says that this was reported on Meduza, this site that's a foreign agent. So she said that she had been pressured to come to Petersburg. She lives in the Petersburg region for questioning. And so she did finally go with one of her children, her oldest child. And while she was at the police station for questioning, apparently the police came to her home, got her younger children out of there, made them leave, and may have searched her apartment. So just there's less and less, there are fewer and fewer places where you can find out about what's going on. And now in terms of how Western media covered this, well, we would have stories about the protests, and obviously when I'm just speaking about how we covered it. Obviously, when Navalny returned to Russia, for example, the most famous example, and flew in from Germany with his wife, with Yulia, and as soon as he landed, they were separated. He was detained. So then immediately obviously she became the center of attention, and we started covering that. So there certainly have been a number of stories about Yulia Navalny and about Lyubov Sobol. But to some extent, there is a limited opportunity to cover all of the issues, to go more deeply into them. I mean, that's one of the problems now, with so much going on in the world.
Thank you. I mean, those examples were really illustrative and speak to the importance of free media, and the crackdowns you mentioned and the labeling of artists as a foreign agent sort of speaks to my next question. In your reporting, you write a lot about protest art in Russia, which, being an art and culture festival, is of particular interest to us here at Feminis Veritas. And in our previous conversations, Sophia, you mentioned the role artists like Pussy Riot have played in changing the environment of political protest art in Russia, namely their 2012 performance in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior. And Pussy Riot is once again playing a role in the Navalny protests. They recently published a new music video, Rage, calling for the release of Navalny and all political prisoners. What role do you see art playing in political activism in Russia? And can art be seen as maybe a response to the barriers of political participation in Russia?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say how important and symbolic Pussy Riot's initial protest at Christ the Savior Cathedral was, because it struck so many raw nerves, reaching deeply back into Russian history and the Russian attitude towards the church and religion. The cathedral, just for short context, was blown up at Stalin's orders and turned into a swimming pool in Soviet times. There was a grassroots movement to rebuild it in the late Soviet era, but then it was ultimately rebuilt with money of rich oligarchs in the 1990s, so which contributed to a rather gaudy recreation of it, and it became a symbol of the symbiosis of church and state and of corruption. So if you read the text of Pussy Riot's punk prayers, it was called at the time, it was in fact a prayer to the Virgin Mary, in the Russian Orthodox Church referred to as the Mother of God, and it was a prayer to her to punish corrupt officials, Putin and the Patriarch, and to chase them from the temples. So there are all kinds of religious references there. Now, the official church, they reacted very obviously virulently to this, but even within the church, there was division on this. In other words, people, including some priests, calling for mercy to them, that they're saying the church should be a symbol of mercy and we should be merciful to them. And maybe they're right about some of the things they said. There are also comparisons made to something known in Russian history and Russian church history as the Holy Fools. So those are people who violated social norms. They didn't fit into social norms and often spoke truth to power. But some of these people became saints, and some of the most famous examples of these fools for Christ were women, such as the saint known as Saint Stena of Petersburg. Now, Nadia Tolokonnikova and Masha Alevtina, the main participants in 2012, after their prison sentence, they used some of the money that they were awarded, I think, by Western organizations to create a media site called Media Zonas. So they used their power as artists to create this news site that they presented as a prisoners' rights and women's rights site, but it's become very important in covering the protests. So in terms of art and political activism, I think art can certainly be seen and used as a response to this. This can be seen as well in Russia. Something I've written about is this street art in Russia, and they're one of the centers of, or I think the center of street art in Russia is Yekaterinburg, and the street artists there have played a political role, and their art addresses political issues. I do actually want to, one thing I forgot to mention in the beginning about Pussy Riot, just in the impact this had in the West, aside from the political impact, is when I first wrote about them, when it first happened, in the first articles I wrote, I was not allowed to use their name because you couldn't actually at that time yet say Pussy Riot in like mainstream media, but that changed quickly. But there are also there's the visual art and theater in Russia plays a big role, and I think everyone has heard of the case of Kirill Serebrennikov, the theater director who was tried allegedly on corruption charges, but his certainly supporters regard it as absolutely a political case. Another theater I've written about is called Saturdok, and they portray the realities of Russian life through documentary theater. But one has to remember the growing restrictions. So one that is coming up that I've also written about for the art newspaper is a new law that will require the licensing of lecturers. So lectures are a very big thing in Russia at museums, especially in Moscow and Petersburg, but they touch on all kinds of topics, including feminism and political protest in art. But once this law takes effect, lecturers have to be licensed by the state. So you can imagine what that will lead to. I mean, it certainly seems like it's leading to something totalitarian. So to sum up, I mean, what is happening in art is in many ways a response to this, but the pressure keeps growing and growing, and the attempts to silence artists are certainly growing.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think our festival actually was created as a response to this sort of repressive environment in Russia and Belarus. And over the weekend, we tried to highlight in our exhibitions political art from the region, sort of highlighting their stories in Berlin, where there's a much more open environment for it, and trying to show people in the West the realities of what people are facing. So thank you for your answer. And for the last part, we're going to sort of switch gears again and talk about democratization. And I'm going to go to Alevtina for these questions. And in your work at the Fund of Belarus for Belarus Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, you and your team obviously work on democratization issues within Belarus. How have the protests changed your work, and how would you assess democratization in Belarus following the protests?
Thank you. Indeed, not an easy question, I would say. When we are talking about democratization or our contribution to this, we support civil society. So for us, this is the main task. And as civil society is being exposed so much to different threats, and in the recent weeks, even almost being like intentionally diminished, of course, it doesn't make our work easier. But I should say that our program has been working quite underground, I would say, during the whole period of time. And we supported a huge range of organizations and activists, and we just continued our work. So basically, it has become more dangerous sometimes for the partners, but we pay more attention to the security measures, and we pay more attention to the secure communication and sources of communication, and trying to make our support as available as possible for those who need it. Basically, we are not forcing democratization, if I can put it this way. Again, we respond on the demand, or we see what is happening in Belarus. We see how our partners react on the situation, and then try to help and support whenever or however we can. In the recent month, or I would say even the last year, the focus switched a lot to the maintaining civil society, so to say. So the task was to keep what was still working, and just to make sure that people can continue their activities, that they can be safe and in safety, and if they have to leave the country, and supporting projects within Belarus and abroad if it's possible. I mean, if it's possible still in Belarus. Interestingly enough, this recent wave of delegitimization or the legalization, if I can put it this way, of Belarusian civil society, it didn't hit it as much as we could expect, because many organizations were prepared. For them, it was basically logical consequence of the politics, what was happening for the last year or even years in Belarus, and they were already prepared to switch their activities or to move out and basically to continue their work abroad, for example. I would say that we pay a lot of attention to, again, to keep the current structures working and to prepare the ground for the situation when the dictatorship will fall, basically, and then when the democratization process can properly start. Because for now, I mean, there is no real democratization happening from the state perspective, of course, but the civil society movement is not vanished. The fact that the organizations are illegal now and their work is illegal, it doesn't mean that that they don't continue their activities, and they prepare as well the ground for the time when it will be over, and then the new Belarus can be built, so to say. And we try to support them as much as we can in this sense. So not being too emotional about this, but still it's a very hard process, and democratization process is happening also on the ground in Belarus. And mentioning, for example, these grassroots initiatives, I mean, a lot has happened, and what is certain that the minds have been changed, and many people who haven't been involved in the civil society activities before are now, and even knowing that it is dangerous, they continue their work. And what is really touching to see how people follow on their agendas and don't leave the situation as it is, so to say, that they already have seen that the change is possible and they are responsible for this change, and then just they pursue these tasks. Yeah, again, if I can put it this way. So basically, I would say the democratic country means strong civil society. It is not the case in Belarus now, but we are on the way, and I really strongly believe that this process will go on, and as feminism is a process, democratization is a process. It is going on, and this goes aligned with in very important process for Belarus as well, what I mentioned before, the nation building, because I could say that there was no such Belarusian nation in the sense how we can see it being built now. And I guess that the society should go through this certain process, which unfortunately for Belarus is being as painful as for many other countries and neighboring countries as well. But yeah, the process is going on. And coming back to our support, we pay a lot of attention also to rehabilitation and relocation. So again, to provide support where is needed, and to plan for the future, to save the status quo at least, and to make sure that there is something which could be developed when Belarus will be free, and then there will be new Belarus rebuilt, so to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very helpful note. Yeah, Yulia, we wanted to chime in.
Yeah, just a small remark, as because I'm a part of this civil society organization, one of those Belarusian who, as I mentioned before, right now have to work outside Belarus, but we're still keeping this doing this for Belarus. I would like to say just a very, very big thank you to the German Marshall Fund, because yes, I know from my colleagues that they really support and they're really very flexible in this situation, because they see such organization could leave country, and it's really very hard for them, but it's really very important to have this kind of support, and that's very, very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great sentiment. I think it's great that we collaborate on this work and sort of get the message out for like a hopeful future for Belarus. And I want to ask one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Studies on democratization and gender equality have shown that there is some correlation between the two. And I just want to ask you, Alevtina, in your view, what role does gender equality play in democratization?
Yeah, it's a bit of a philosophical question, even, I would say. If I can talk from my personal perspective, I think this is a very crucial part. And for me, it's like not self-explaining, but this is as important as every other aspect of democratization. Basically, I can't really imagine a democratic society without equality. And this includes not only gender equality, but every part of inclusion into society. So different groups, like, for example, LGBTIQ agenda and people with disabilities and so on and so on. So it's not only a bigger picture then, so fuller society and in itself, but it gives a bigger perspective. So I believe that again, as you mentioned, there are countless studies on this which show certain correlations. And although still, if we are talking about Russia and Belarus here, there are some differences, like, for example, global gender gap indexes. I believe that Russia was on 80-something place and Belarus on 30-something. So there are quite a significant difference in between, but still, I wouldn't say that, I mean, both countries are not democratic as for now. And does it mean that Belarus is more gender equal? Maybe, but there's still, I would say, a huge range of different factors which you should consider answering to such questions or identifying such issues. So for me, the status of democracy depends on the empowerment of women, basically. It gives, again, it gives a different perspective, and if women participate in decision-making process, and they have a role to play or have leading positions, it means also the greater response to the issues in the society, to different issues in the society and to different needs. So not only being, again, maybe there is some sentiments involved showing that women are more sensitive or sensible, more empathetic, but I believe that there is a certain value which is being added just by women being involved. I mean, this all in addition to the fact that this is kind of it should be just equal for men and women, and we I think in democratic societies we accept it as a fact, and still there is so much to be explained about it, surprisingly. For example, in Belarus, I believe between 18 or 20 and 28% of women are involved in leading positions and in higher positions, and it is considered to be a good number. I mean, it is far away from 50 even, and it's still, again, considered as a good situation. I think these are, I mean, one big topic is to work with women on this, to kind of empower them and to let them know what is actually the issue, because I believe that many still are not aware, especially yeah, what was Sophia was talking about concerning Russia, and I think in Belarus it's still the case as well, that it is very patriarchal society, and women they take a lot of responsibilities, but still don't see it as an additional burden, and they don't compare their role with the role of men. It's just as a fact, and they just exist in this society, which is actually not considered to be equal as it is. So there is much to work on this perspective, but at the same time, the society itself is not built the way to make these positions, for example, as easily available for women as for men. And the gap between salaries still remains. Even in Germany it remains, but in Belarus it's at least around 30%, I would say. So there is still huge work to be done. So and this is all, from my point of view, directly connected to the democratization process. So unless there will be not just pronounced gender equality, but else actually being like lived in this gender equality, I think that it will remain an issue. And yeah, so coming back to the question, actually, I think gender equality plays a very crucial role in the democratization process.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response, and thank you all again for agreeing to participate in this discussion. It's been a very enlightening discussion, and we've been going for a bit over an hour now, so I just wanted to wrap things up and ask you all to sort of give you a final word and try to end on a positive note. If you could keep it brief, maybe I just want to ask all of you what your hope for the future of gender equality in Russia and Belarus is. And Sophia, we can start with you if you'd like, and then that'll be the end of our discussion. And thank you all again for being here today.
Well, I actually just like to keep it on the personal level that I mentioned that I do see very positive things in people that until very recently I saw around me in Russia. I see these examples in the way people behave within their families. And I just also saw on social media a couple of weeks ago, I spoke about young families, but I saw a grandfather, that someone I know, writing about his granddaughter and essentially making this huge feminist statement that he'd become very angry in the past year about how COVID was being handled in Russia, among other things, by the church, and he said, I don't want my granddaughter to grow up in such a society, and I'm basically going to fight for her not to live in a society where women are treated like this. That made me very happy.
Thank you, Julia. If you wanted to chime in with your sort of final word.
I'm very positive as well as Sophia, and I totally agree with everything that Alevtina mentioned. And I think if women could be in front of the protest, why they can't be in the political decision making on different levels, they can, and we can do it for sure. Yes, and I remember when we had negotiations with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and she asked me about, could you tell me what gender equality is, very briefly, and I answered, gender equality is about democracy, because there is no any modern country in the modern world that we could say that democratic society or democratic country if they don't have a gender equality. And I really believe that in the future we could promote this issue and in a different levels, because quantitative and qualitative. As we know, for instance, in Belarusian parliament, we have more than 30% of women, but they don't represent women interest because they were appointed, not elected. And that's very important to promote this for women, including women, but also it's very important when men understand that gender equality is really very profitable for the whole society, for making a democratic process and for making democracy as a whole for themselves as well. And but we still in Belarus, and I believe in Russia as well, women need to get this support, because I remember when we had these answers on the research that we made within the feminist group, many women who made a great impact on not only this process of protest, but also being like volunteers, writing letters to the political prisoners, making different stuff for them and doing a lot of work, but they mentioned they don't see that this is something very important. And that's really very, very important to show and to support them, because it's very undemocratic, I believe, if the half of population don't have same opportunities and same possibilities and same positions as other half of population in the certain country. And we in this process to promote this, and I really believe that we can do it together.
Thank you. That was a lovely response. Yeah, same question to you, Alevtina.
It's hardly something left to add, to be honest, after such a good speech of Yulia, but I would try. I think it's very important, again, for women to be aware of gender equality is actually in Belarus and Russia, and of course all the other countries as well. And even talking about Belarus, it's not even the half of the population, it's a bigger part of it, women, because at least a few percent, they are more than men and live at least a few years longer. So it's just really unwise, I would say, to not to consider this group as a powerful one, which it is actually. And I would wish for these societies that women and men, they just have a choice. So, for example, if a woman if she wants to become a leader and take leading position, that she just has every opportunity a man would have, and the same for men basically. And we can really emphasize it, that this is beneficial for both, for men and women and every other gender in between, or every person basically. So I would just really wish again for these societies that it will be not a negotiation issue, but a fact, and will be accepted by everybody.
Thank you. I think now we're going to open it up to questions. And if any of our audience has a question, they can post it in the chat. And I think we'll wait and see if any questions come in. But thank you all for being here again. And I really enjoyed our conversation we had. I think it's very important to talk about these issues, and yeah, and also to have an international audience and sort of let people know what's happening in Belarus, and hear from Belarusians and activists and journalists that are in these countries, so, and in Russia as well. So thank you again. We have our first question, which I'm just going to read out loud. Lukashenko didn't consider Tikhonovskaya an equal rival at the beginning, but as he is responding with oppression to her supporters, do you think his mind has changed? I don't know which one of you would like to answer that question. If anyone has any immediate thoughts, you can go ahead and respond.
I would say that his perception has definitely changed. I can't imagine that he sees Tikhonovskaya now as a leader, but I think he recognized that he made a mistake. underestimating the reaction and underestimating the power people's minds had. I mean, voting for her actually, and then she is able to unite so many people around her. So you can even see it as an example that in the beginning she was basically forcefully thrown out of the country, and then he requested her extradition from Lithuania. I mean, not taking, I mean, from one perspective, it is him being inconsequent, which is not surprisingly for us now, because I mean, many of his actions are illogical, and yeah, we can argue about it. But basically, I think it is also a sign of him recognizing his failure on this.
Yeah, Yulia, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or do you think? Yeah.
Oh, I totally agree with what Alevtina said.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. That's our first question. I'll just give it a couple minutes, see if we get any others. Yeah, and if not, thank you again for being here. And I had a great conversation with all of you today, and hope you as well.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, and congratulations on such a wonderful festival.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, we're really excited about the project, so we're happy with how it turned out. Yeah.
Thank you again. It was really very fruitful and interesting conversation to me. Thank you to my interesting and inspiring colleagues.
Thank you very much as well to Kali and to Yulia and to Alevtina. It was very interesting.
Thank you so much. Okay, if there's no further questions, I think I'm just going to end the session with where it was, because I think we touched on a lot of topics, and there's probably a lot of people need to digest. And this is recorded, and we are going to be posting this on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page. And so if anyone wants to go back and look over our discussion, it will be there. Thank you all for watching today, and yeah, have a great rest of your day or evening.